I'd like to begin by thanking Haig and Lou and James. I'm really enjoying the workshop. I very much enjoyed the anticipation of it and thinking about it, but I'd have to admit I've struggled a little bit with working out how to pitch it and how to present it, so I'll see how I get on. In some ways I feel the two presentations in the session match each other or complement each other quite well, not because I'm really a typical international lawyer at all. I'm actually an international lawyer. I just sort of make up that bit. I'm really in IR, but what my theoretical work does is link the content of international law to power politics, essentially, and I do that theoretically using ideology theory. And so that really is my theoretical framework. So in that sense, I complement what Joel's done in that his is a functionalist approach, and he said functionalist and liberal approach, whereas if anything, I'm more a realist, but one who deals with ideas. So people call me different things. Some say a critical constructivist, and I don't really mind what label people attach to me, because I don't think I'm properly easily pigeonholed. But I'm certainly not just a functionalist, because to me, international law is embedded in relationships of power. And so I agree with Joel's idea that there's certain functions that need to be fulfilled, and international law.
Joel, can you please mute yourself?
That's who we're looking for.
So sorry.
Hi, Joel. I was just talking about you actually, and I was just saying that while I would agree with you that a functionalist explanation shows why a world government is a possible eventuality, I don't see that it shows why it's the best or the only one, and it may well be the best. So I believe that certainly our system of global governance at the moment is quite dysfunctional and incapable of addressing the global issues, and I think we need to be thinking of all possible new options, including a world government. But I wouldn't say that I'm convinced that it's the answer or that we're going to get there. So that's putting my cards on the table, I guess, from the beginning. So you'll see I've headed mine from international rule of law to rules-based international order, the recent shift away from the trend towards global integration by international law. So my thesis is essentially that if we were going to get there, we've missed some key points when it might have happened, and in actual fact, current trends would be away from that. I do think that it's possible that we'll have one of these crises that people referred to yesterday, which will bring about something different at a global level. However, it seems to me that if we look at the experience of democracies during times of major crises such as war, they don't actually become more democratic at those points. They become less democratic. They tend to go into a more authoritarian style for the duration of the crisis. And so one of the projects I've been working on, which, I mean, I can relate to this because it's also not something that the mainstream would agree with, but I'm working on a project to look at what the UN Security Council could do about climate change. So what it would do if we get to this point of absolute crisis, because at the moment the Security Council is the go-to body for major international security crises. So what it would do or could do in those circumstances, but also what it could be doing now, in a sense, to prepare itself for being able to step up to the plate. So, and legally, it has the authority, the rule, you know, the powers to do that. So, I guess what I'm saying is, to me, if one of those crises lead us to a fundamental change at a global level, it's more likely to be to something with a smaller group of decision makers and more authoritarian, rather than suddenly setting up a global parliament to deal with the crisis. But I think that's an interesting point for us to maybe discuss. So I think they're the points I've just made, that I'm going to be looking at whether trends in international law suggest that we are at present moving closer to getting a world parliament. And to do that, I'm going to maybe mention a little bit on a theoretical line, but I also want to start with a bit more of a historical story. Well, actually, there's a bit of theoretical. I think I've mentioned them. Functionalist is an approach to explaining the political role played by international law, but from my perspective, it's impossible to understand the political role without taking into account structures of political power. The international legal system we know is largely the one that evolved through the US era. It was a source of power on which the US could draw, but that the US could not totally control. It's a largely autonomous subsystem, but also a dimension of US power. So that's how I read what we've come from. So let me explain that a bit more. And the way I thought I'd do it is more with a story than too much heavy-duty theory. So I'd like to go as my jumping off point, the peace movement that sprang up in North America and Europe after the Napoleonic Wars. At least 4 peace societies were established in 1815 to 16. In 1928, William Ladd united these societies into the ones in the US into a national organisation called the American Peace Society. The aims of this society were to show war in its deformity, to search for the cause of war, to portray the consequences of war, to teach followers the precepts of the gospel of peace, to bring about a pacific spirit among Christians, a disgust for war, a relish for peace, and to lessen the cause and frequency of war, which were all noble aims, I'm sure you'll agree. The next decade, the society decided to hold an essay competition to come up with schemes of how to do this. And the 5 best essays were published, and then Will was asked to take all the unsuccessful essays, I'm sure some of you know this story, to take all the unsuccessful essays and to basically get the best ideas out of them, put them into another one which was going to be published alongside the winners. And it's actually the 6th essay that William Ladd put together, based mainly on other people's ideas, that has stood the test of time. And for the very reason I'd suggest that much of what he set out in there, you could say, did come into being by the late 20th century. So what they're essentially seeking to devise was none less than a system of international government or governance. The rationale was straightforward. If there was a code by which countries behaved and a judiciary to decide any disputes about the application of those rules, it would obviate the need for countries to resort to arms. William advocated that there be created an international judiciary, a Congress of Nations to make the rules, and that public opinion function as the executive. Although, as I say, a lot of this was not his own work, William did take credit for one thing in the plan, and that was that the international judiciary and Congress be separate institutions. Now, there's been lots of other thinkers, as many of you in particular know, about the possibility of world government. But certainly his was very influential, and certainly international law was there in that vision. And as law became a profession, and as international law became something other than studied by philosophers, which was really during the 19th century, then we did take steps towards realising something very similar to this vision. In 1899, the Permanent Court of International Arbitration was established in The Hague. That was a bit of a misnomer. It was neither a court nor permanent. But what it consisted of was an administrative headquarters and a permanent list of arbitrators that could be drawn on. So in one sense, it was seen as a step towards a world court. And as an aside, that is the body that's currently dealing with the dispute between the Philippines and China regarding the South China Sea. So that still exists. But it was a forerunner to the Permanent Court of International Arbitration, International Justice, and then the International Court of Justice, which, as you know, in the second half of the 20th century became supplemented by a whole range of specific courts and tribunals, and continued since after the end of the Cold War. So in a way, we were getting an international judiciary just as these people in the 19th century imagined would be a great idea. And while people are critical of it in that it's not compulsory judiciary, in actual fact, William Ladd never believed it should be, which is quite interesting. So, as I understand, I stand to be corrected, but my understanding is that it wasn't so. We're not that far off what he wanted with an international international judiciary. But we haven't got the Congress of Nations, right? We've never got this body to make the rules at a global level that are then going to be applied by the World Court. We have the UN General Assembly, but that wasn't designed as legislature. It's more making policy recommendations as opposed to laws. However, there has been an enormous expansion of international law during the era of the United States. And the vehicle for that has been the multilateral treaty, primarily, rather than a global parliament. So it seems to me if we are trying to bring this question down to practical impediments, the stepping stone that would need to happen is that from the multilateral treaty as the vehicle for developing international law to some sort of world parliament or congress. So sometimes when I'm talking about how we've been in this, the characteristics of international law as we see it today, or certainly until recently, have been so influenced by the US and its rise to power and the way it operates in the international arena, I set out these 8 characteristics of international law during the US era. I could probably come up with more, but here's a sort of starting point. So it's continually expanded, both quantitatively and qualitatively. It's moved into just about every aspect of relations, certainly amongst states, not so strongly all actors at an international level. As I've just mentioned, treaty law has been the most important source of law in a practical sense, even though it's not within international law, a hierarchy of sources. And the multilateral treaty is ubiquitous. It seems to be that whenever there's a problem, people think we're going to solve it by getting a multilateral treaty. Or they certainly have, which is quite amazing because in actual fact most multilateral treaties haven't solved the problems that they were set out to solve. They tend to have been treated as management devices. In other words, they do enough to take the issue off the agenda and remove the sort of threat in a policy sense to governments. But in most cases, they don't actually solve the problem. The ozone depletion is one of the regimes that I think has probably come closest to that. But most of them, and we can all think of examples, are renowned for not really being effective. Refugee Convention, just about anything you think of. International law has been a universal secular medium for bargaining, in which sovereignty is the criterion for participation. So I think if we're looking at it from a US perspective, the US sort of came to power being an anti-colonial state, but in a sense it did have empire light, as it's been referred to, and a lot of how it's conducted that is by countries having their sovereignty, but then having to bargain with the US via treaty making, essentially. And virtually all treaties have been unequal. We associate the term unequal treaties with what was done to China and other Asian countries in the 19th century. The cornerstone multilateral treaties of global governance, they're fundamentally unequal, and that's the attraction for the powerful states, really, that they've been able to bring states together, but they don't actually want to have a level playing field. And again, one slight frustration I have sometimes when I'm talking with IR people and political scientists, and I'm having the same debate at the moment with all the constructivists and the norm theorists and so on, that they don't want to actually theorise where international law fits in, but their assumption is that the norm is being successful when it's embedded in a treaty. Well, it's a lot more complex than that, because you can get the treaty there and then the key powers not ratify or not support it or whatever. So the whole story is very complex and quite subtle, and it's really been a key source of how the US and the West has conducted their power relations. International law has brought about considerable inroads into the rights of sovereign states, some states more than others. Non-state actors, and this is partly why I wanted to bring William Ladd into it, that it's not just the US state that's been behind this, NGOs have been behind it. And usually with great intentions, and usually, as we heard yesterday, with a real focus on their specific subject matter and great usually great goals, right, for justice, human rights, improving the environment, and so on. And actually in the real hardcore areas of international law as well, they've had much more impact than most people assume. So the international law on the use of force, stepping stones to getting the prohibition on first use of force in the UN Charter, was very much the action of some of these people, again coming out of this peace movement and project for international law. And there's great stories there that I'd love to tell you, but diverge into. So it wasn't only the US state. The states have been increasingly held accountable for their actions in respect of international law, including through the growing number of international courts, tribunals and quasi-judicial mechanisms. I think I've addressed that. International law has become very much a profession, a whole world of its own. However, it's been widely portrayed as something positive and rhetorically associated with human rights and justice. And this gets me, I suppose, to what I alluded to at the beginning, of my sort of theoretical framework within which I do a lot of my work, is that I would theorise the power of international law as embedded in a particular ideal, or I'd say ideology, of what international law is about. And basically that it's about that law is distinct from power politics. And to a certain extent it is, right? So I'm not someone who just says the two are synonymous, that power is the same as US power is the same as international law. It's not. The US can't get, and that's why it's so complex, right? Because the US can't just do everything it wants via international law. Otherwise, other states wouldn't have supported it. Decolonised states wouldn't have wanted to become a part of it. It was just a way to keep them down. Look at the rise of China. It's been able to do it through the system of international law. So it's not as simple as just saying, the power of the state has been the power of international law. However, I would say underpinning the power of international law as an autonomous and distinct source of power has been this ideal that it is distinct from power politics. And people still don't really get beyond that. I'm being critical of my own discipline to a large extent, in that they don't really analyse international law enough I think in their analysis of power politics. So in a way, they've sort of bought the ideology, if you know what I mean, or maybe they think it doesn't make any difference, but I think we can point to places where it has made a big difference. Now, this ideal and this ideology that international law is distinct from power politics, that it's something other than realpolitik, the US made a big deal about in the 1930s, that this was the way of the future. And it has still used it enormously in its diplomacy. So, as I say, one way is by getting multilateral treaties that has the right terms, but another one is in its diplomacy, is drawing on that ideal. Other states wanting to look like they're complying with international law and needing to because of the enforcement provisions that there is enforcement, but it's unequally enforced. And so upholding this ideal has been very important to the US, and the US, as you know, has made a lot of use of rhetoric of international law in its diplomacy. Now, the fact that this system has been used by the US and the West to its advantage so much, others haven't, they haven't it hasn't just passed them by. So China, I don't think, it's very much in their consciousness that international law was used in the 19th century in a terrible way, and they worked very hard through diplomatic channels in the 20th century to have the relevant parts of international law, that is the treaty law, changed to prevent that. But when we got the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, it didn't actually rule out unequal treaties. It just ruled out treaties being made by threat or use of force. So you can't actually take your warship into the harbour and force a state to sign, but sort of bar that, you can have unequal treaties. I think the assumption was that with sovereignty, states wouldn't enter into unequal treaties, but of course for a whole host of reasons they do. I won't go into all that, that's a bit of an aside as well. But Putin also seems to be completely taken by this idea, and his rhetoric is full of references to international law and how it's been used by the US and the West. So, for example, just one quote, he said, well, he referred to it having come to reflect the preferences and character of the United States legal system, and then he said, instead it's necessary to make sure that international law has a universal character both in the conception and application of its norms. So are we going to, do I see us therefore moving from these multilateral treaties to a world legislature? Well, no, because of the sort of reasons I'm already pointing to, that while the project to get international courts there continued even after the end of the Cold War, that seemed to be one moment where if we were going to get one, that's when we would have got one, right? End of the Cold War, when liberal democracy appeared to have triumphed again, but I don't think there was a strong move to have it there, and I can't see the United States as wanting a sort of democratic legislature. Not just the United States, but I guess just as if there was a move to have one, there'd be enormous politics going into the structure of it, and none of the major powers would agree to it unless they thought it was going to be a way of achieving their objectives. We've actually had the decline of the multilateral treaty in recent years, largely because of the shifting distribution of power. It's just not possible for the West to bring others on board onto unequal treaties, so we've had stalemates in most cases, and treaty regimes that are up and running have reached stalemates within them. The United States has valiantly, or the executive in some areas, has tried to still act in good faith through what has been called stealth multilateralism, that's sort of finding ways around it, but essentially its hands have been tied by the Senate that, as people know, is fundamentally opposed to the idea of international law as a way of undermining US power. We've had a rise of innovative forums at a global level, really because of the blockages in the major treaty regimes. But I'd say, and I'll just finish on this point, that the major problem is that if the idea of world government is part of this agenda we've had really since the 19th century to have a global executive, legislature, judiciary, then the United States, it's walking away from the ideal, to me, is the ultimate problem we've got at the moment. The executive, because of the US not having ratified key treaties, is actually, in many cases, downplaying the importance of international law in its diplomacy and rhetoric, which undermines that whole ideology of international law as a non-political way of dealing with international issues. So Paris, this whole thing, was it going to be a treaty, not a treaty? Needed to be a treaty, right? The Iran deal, not a treaty, needed to be a treaty. It's a major stepping stone in the nuclear issue. Wasn't a treaty. US couldn't make it a treaty. South China Sea, the United States can't. It does sometimes refer to international law, but it goes on about rules-based international order. Why? Because it hasn't ratified the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. So the rhetoric now, and it's pervasive, of this rules-based international order. A rules-based international order is not international law. The international law of the project towards international judiciary, international Congress, executive, because international law is a cohesive system that is stable, slow to change, and its internal logic and coherence is a great stabilising feature in the international system. A rules-based international order, they don't have to be law-based rules, it doesn't have to be coherent, there's no danger in suddenly changing one part of the system because it won't have flow-on consequences in the same way as changing one part of a coherent system of international law would do. So rather than a cohesive universal law-making system emerging, I'd say we're getting sort of pockets of law-making that isn't necessarily, of rules-making, which isn't necessarily law-making at a global level. And we're seeing the United States effectively abandoning the whole sort of ideal of international law in its rhetoric and its actions in terms of multilateral treaties.